Buonasera. First of all, I will speak English, but if you want to speak in Italian or in French, I will understand. And if you speak in Catalan, I would be delighted. First of all, let me thank sincerely the Balzan Foundation, my foundation, and the Università della Svizzera Italiana per the invitation that they have addressed to me, so that I have the possibility of sharing with you tonight some of the findings and ideas of my most recent research. I found extremely interesting and to the point the preliminary remarks by my colleague, the rector of the university. If you allow me, we can engage that discussion later on, because this is not what I'm going to talk about. But you're absolutely right, it's directly linked, and I have been working on social movements for quite a while. Today I would like to go into the heart of what is happening now, which is the crisis of the political system, of one particular political system, which is the system of liberal democracy, which there are exceptions, there are always exceptions, but the main trend is toward the crisis of a form of political representation that has been with us for a long, long time, and that is clearly challenged these days, certainly in Europe, certainly in the United States, but all over the world. Just go over the information just last month, Brazil, Korea, wherever you want. Now, but this is related to the kind of work that I started at the time when the Balzan Foundation was interested in my work. Since 2008, I concentrated an effort to understand the crisis, economic crisis originally, but then multidimensional crisis in the United States and particularly in Europe. I published a volume called Aftermath, which is there, and it's about another volume to be published in August. Now, this was about the crisis that suddenly I saw, and with a number of colleagues we work on it, which was not simply an economic crisis, was not simply a financial crisis, was a multidimensional crisis that included a social crisis, a cultural crisis, an institutional crisis. And of all these crises that are interrelated, it seemed to me very quickly that the most important crisis was the crisis of liberal democracy, the crisis of the political system. Why? Because if there is a gap between citizens and the representatives, if there is a gap between what happens in society and how people feel about that and governments, this is a fundamental gap. Because everything government decides becomes illegitimate and therefore has to be imposed. And in democratic societies, imposition as a way of governing cannot go on for a long, long time. That was my hypothesis. And I started to work on that. And you know what? Exactly. It's not going on anymore. Country after country after country, the mechanisms of political governance and representation are being called into question. And in this, I am strictly analytical and not normative. I don't love Trump. I had a very hard time to study Brexit on the ground, but this is so important that researchers, social science, political science, economics researchers, we have to face what's happening beyond the simple rejection or approval that we are seeing throughout the world. So this is the kind of research I'm going to present to you today, research which is being done at this point. Although the first volume already touches on that, it's a volume that simply called Europe's Crisis, that I have organized with 12 leading intellectuals and researchers from all over Europe for 4 years working on that, and it's been published in August by Polity Press in Cambridge and then a number of other presses in different countries. Now, let me first clarify what I'm talking about in terms of the crisis of liberal democracy. It's simply the crisis is based on the crisis of political legitimacy, or what the political scientists call political legitimacy, which is very simple. People, the large majority of cities in the world, save Switzerland for the time being. We can talk later about Switzerland. By the way, you know, my dear colleague, that the ones who are enthusiastic about Swiss democracy are Podemos in Spain. They say again and again that what they want is that Spain becomes like Switzerland, not like Venezuela, like Switzerland. Okay, so in that sense, you have a very strong point. And then, so there are a number of exceptions and how things still work in some democracies. But I decided that we can divide the work. You work on the successful stories, and I work on the misery of the world, which is plenty of material to be understood in this sense. So, but in terms of the empirical fact, we start with the notion in terms of every possible opinion poll for years, from the World Value Survey to all the barometers that exist in the world, to everything. They show the large majority of citizens in the world don't feel represented by their governments, and more than that, they despise politicians in general and the political parties in particular. The word's association with political parties is corruption, bureaucracy, mafia, etc., etc., etc. And this is universal, okay? So that is the crisis of legitimacy. For a while, the notion was, okay, but they keep voting, nothing happened, yeah, people are always cynical, they don't pay attention, they go on with their lives. Until something happens, meaning until a deep economic structural crisis like 2008 interrupts the normal reproduction of the system. And then what happens is that the decisive thing at that moment to correct the dysfunctions of the market, financial speculation, everything you want to include there, has to be restored by whom? Exactly by the actor that had been excluded from all the neoliberal paradigms, particularly in neoclassical economy. Remember when everybody was saying, now again, they say again, the main thing for economic policy is that governments stay out of the market. The market knows. Oh, really? So in the fall of 2008, financial capitalism collapsed. Literally collapsed. One good example, AIG. AIG, as you know well, is the insurance company that insures 70% of the banks in the world. AIG literally collapsed. Leaving the market to deal with that would have meant the collapse of a large majority of the banks in the world. At that point, but later on, so what happened, as you know, the American government nationalized AIG. Nationalize is a big word, right? And they didn't call it nationalize. They simply bought 80% of the shares. With the notion that it will be returned. It has been returned. So it's not that suddenly the system has to be organized by the state. It simply means that the state has a crucial function of regulation, surveillance, control of how things are going. And what happened is that when people realized that the priority at the moment when people were losing their jobs, the moment when mortgages were foreclosed, etc., when at that moment the priority, and one can argue technically that that was correct, the priority was to save the banks, save the financial institutions, save the system in terms of the functioning of capital, and forget about all the human misery because it could not be done at the same time. Moreover, in the perception of most people in the world, governments help the banks and the financial institutions and companies with what? Governments, they don't have their own money, with our money, okay? With the taxpayers' money. So ultimately it was a universal feeling that the financial institutions derailed the system with citizens not having anything to say on that, and government saved the banks with the money of the taxpayers. And that was an absolute outrage in every country. the United States too. Okay? So at that point, this latent crisis of political legitimacy, meaning don't trust the government, don't trust politicians, at that point he had a very concrete experience on which to react and to start thinking about alternative ways, not of an economic system, not about that, but a political system that could be trusted. How? Nobody knew, and nobody knows. But millions of people throughout the world started to organize themselves and protest in a very chaotic way, creative and chaotic at the same time. These were the social movements of all ideologies, outside the political parties, outside the political system. And that's the critical point. The fact that this distrust was then exemplified by the way they handled the economic crisis led to social movements in many, many different countries with different intensity and different forms, including in Italy. Cinque Stelle is not a traditional social movement, but there is a social movement, and its impact on the Italian political system has transformed the Italian political system. One can hate that, but has to start by acknowledging the importance of the phenomenon. So, from this revolt and these alternative images of which kind of forms could be different, again, for the political system to be responsive to the citizens and then being able to regulate, control, and repair the damage in the economic and social system. See, that's the point. Is ultimately the anchoring point was not to attack directly the financial institutions, but the governments who were not responsive to the needs that were expressed in the population at large. So now we are in a different stage. Some of these movements succeeded, others didn't, but they all changed the consciousness of people around the world. They all changed the minds. And that is the real impact of the social movements. Social movements are not political movements. Political movements in the sense that they aim at seizing control of the government or the state or of the administrations. They are movements that are aimed at changing the way we think. And if we change the way we think, everything else changes down the line. How it changes, with which consequences, sorry, totally undetermined, depending on every society. But it does change. So the transition from crisis, economic crisis, amplifying crisis of legitimacy, social movements that emerge from this crisis and therefore aggravate even more the crisis of legitimacy, ultimately starts surfacing by the deep transformation of the institutions themselves. And to show that, and to show some of the causes, origins, and consequences, I have selected the three obvious cases which have strategic importance worldwide. No one thought that the United States of all countries would be the one in which the political system is completely turned upside down, which is the case now. So I focused empirically on Brexit. I spent part of the time in my year at Cambridge, at St. John's College, and I was there, and from Cambridge and throughout England, I did a lot of field work in terms of what was happening during the Brexit campaign that nobody knew, nobody thought that that would happen. Nobody serious, except that the non-serious people, meaning many of the working class Britons, decided that it was going to happen. This we analyzed with this group of researchers, and the results will be published in August. And so Brexit, Trump, very quickly, because much less interesting, France, and then I will try to summarize some of the analytical findings and potential consequences of these three analyses. However, without, at this point, going into everything, remember, I'm taking these cases because are the most relevant, the most important, those with impact throughout the world. But there are many others. The crisis of legitimacy is not confined to a few countries. In Europe, as you know, there is an extraordinary challenge to liberal democracy from many countries. And often people think that these social movements are all nice and blue-eyed and they're going to change the world with wonderful feeling. Not necessarily. In history, we have plenty of examples in which social movements and social protests go into a very nasty way. So that's why I'm strictly non-normative, because we have to recognize every movement and every transformation in the way they happen depending on context and culture. But all challenge the existing political system of institutions. That is what is common. Not that right or left doesn't matter, no. What is common is the challenge to the system as it is now in institutional terms. And this is happening all over Europe. In the Netherlands, everybody had to band together to stop a xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic party. In Scandinavia, our wonderful social democratic Scandinavia that has been a model forever, in Finland there is a xenophobic party in government, in Norway there is a xenophobic party in government, in Denmark the government depends on the xenophobic party in parliament, and only Sweden resists somewhat because the neo-Nazis quadrupled their vote in the last election, but the conservatives and social democrats are trying to contain the thing. Austria, we know, and even in Germany, the Alternative for Germany movement is expanding fast, the social democracy is decomposing fast, and the situation is increasingly uncertain because, again, all the same type of movements. And I stop in Europe because otherwise I could go on and on and on in the world at large. So, what can we learn from these cases which are clearly defining a new political landscape? Brexit. Of course, Brexit changes fundamentally the European Union forever. Even if the movement doesn't expand, although there are symptoms that could, but just the fact that the United Kingdom is not in Europe changes the nature of Europe and changes the future in European Union, which is not the same. You still are Europe. So it changes everything. So what summarizing, and I'm sorry for the elementary character of some of these remarks that I don't think they are very original, but this is what happened. I tell you what has happened, original or not. In terms of the themes, is a decisive criticism to Brussels, meaning to the European Commission and to the European technocracy. That for many years has been the case in Britain, and by the way, is a general feeling throughout Europe. The crisis of legitimacy, particularly of the European institutions, and particularly of the European Commission, is linked to the fact the European Commission always thought they were the government of Europe. They are not. They are bureaucrats at the service of the Council of Ministers, theoretically controlled by the European Parliament, but they don't feel so. So they continue to issue decrees and laws, etc., that then people resent in different countries, and particularly in Britain. The link to this one, the key theme was take control. That was the expression of the Brexit advocates. Take control, meaning affirm national sovereignty. Do not yield national sovereignty to anyone, because that's the only thing we have. In the moment of the global flows of capital and information that nobody controls, in the moment in which governments are not at the international level, all these bureaucracies, we don't know what they are, take control. That was the phrase that was repeated again and again. And of course, against immigration. But which immigration? That's the important thing in Brexit. Not immigration in general. Immigration from Eastern Europe. There was no backlash against third world immigration, that was already there. There was racism as usual, let's say, but no more racism than usual. The all the heat was aimed at Eastern European immigrants. Why? Because they had the rights. They didn't need a visa. They could get jobs. They could get housing and health and education. That no, we are Europeans, but not Europeans to the point that everybody has the same rights. And the fact that in 5 years there were 600,000 Poles and about 200,000 Romanians that landed in Britain was intolerable. Particularly at the time of the austerity policies and the government cutting down social services and social rights. Precisely that. So that shows that it's not the traditional form of xenophobia, is what I call the rejection of what I call globalization from the bottom. The globalization capital flows and globalization from the bottom, which is widespread migration, labor moving from one country to another. Again, in the case of Brexit, that was the critical element. No more. These were the three things, no more themes. All the other things were not Great Britain nationalism. No, it was not that. Nationalism was supposed, but was not that. Was these particular specific topics. Who supported Brexit? Very clearly. The socio-demographic profile is very clear. Working class. Particularly the least educated groups of the population. Working class, men and women, okay? We'll see this in America too. Men and women together in this matter. The less educated segments of the population. Why? Very simple. In a globalized economy, people who have the skills to be global themselves and manage everything that is related to globalization is fantastic. It's fantastic. You have the whole planet for yourself. But who has the whole planet for yourself? You need degrees, let's say, from this university, but you only have 3,000 students. So what happens with the rest of the world? The old people. Why the old people? Again, because they don't have any more chances. They are at the end. Whatever they have, that's what they have. They are not ready to take on the globalized world. They are going to localize themselves like crazy and close the door to see how they can live to the end of their lives peacefully. Not in this whirlwind of new things, machines that talk to each other, machines that connect to each other, and the inability to recognize their own world. The deindustrialized regions, particularly in the north and in the Midlands, that this was the traditional territory of the Labour Party. Suddenly, the Labour Party, under the Third Way and Blair, etc., was the most globalizing party, the most non-working class party, being modern, being dynamic, opening to the new world. Well, they lost entirely the traditional social basis of the Labour Party. And I'm not even discussing that they should do it or not, but I'm simply saying what really happened. That was the origin of losing the deindustrialized regions under the impact of globalization. Because one has to remember, the UK in economic terms is doing very well and was doing quite well. So it's not that, it's who within this prosperity was doing less. Example, 150,000 French financial analysts in London. It doesn't solve the situation in the Midlands. And why did these French would go to London? Because they were better paid and they had more chances to manage the global economy from London, which is a much better financial place than Paris. Then, the rural areas that are not connected to the large metropolitan areas. Again, another cleavage. It's systematic. The countryside feels abandoned and clubbed by Brussels, which has the most stringent protectionist policies, but doesn't help some of the regions of Europe. Helps the French and the German because that's what they got it, but the agricultural budget is provided largely by the United Kingdom. There was areas with more unemployment, but voted for Brexit, but it was not unemployment because unemployment never reached above in the key region 12%. Was, of course, from the Spanish or Greek or Italian situation, that was nothing. So there was regions that were more hit by unemployment voted for Brexit. Again, the same pattern, but there was not the typical thing. There was, in all this, there was one exception in terms of an old industrial region that also was suffering, but voted against Brexit. That's Scotland, for one simple reason, because they want to minimize the British state and maximize the European state so they can get independent. The same thing in Catalonia. The most pro-European in the Spanish state are the Catalans. If they really go on and take out all the sovereignty from all the national governments, we have more chances than with the Spanish government. So the same thing with Scotland, with Wales, etc. Now, third layer of analysis, the political instrument of Brexit. Everybody would expect that was the UKIP, the extreme right party that would be able to mobilize, because always they have been xenophobic, always against the European Union. No, it didn't happen this way. Because what was critical was the so-called Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party that simply stole all these ideas from the UKIP and launched their own xenophobic movement and their own anti-European movement. Why? Because they always were nationalists in the traditional sense, but these nationalists didn't have the social basis and social support that ultimately they found. And this pressure from the Eurosceptics forced Cameron to actually promise a referendum. And all the European leaders, I have read all their speeches and I had talked to some of them, they say, that's the fault of Cameron. He's irresponsible. He should never have promised a referendum and even less do it. That's exactly the point. The political class in Europe has come to think that you should never consult the stupid citizens because you can have all kinds of bad surprises. So you just have to keep going. Then at the moment, every 4 years, you make a little jump, you develop a number of strategies, you jump that obstacle and you keep going. And never consult. And that was exactly the case for the entire construction of the European Union. And there were some glitches in the way. For instance, when they tried to, when they felt that the situation was controlled, bringing in the notion of a European constitution that would be approved by people in referendums, and therefore finally would be a legitimacy. Would not be simply a construction of the political elites and economic elites, but a legitimacy supported by people. Well, it didn't work that way. Spain and Portugal voted immediately yes, but only 30% of people participated because that was not the issue at that point. But the important thing, when the big stage started, France said no, the Netherlands said no, and then at that point, Ireland said not under these conditions, and then the Conservative Party in Britain said, well, we will do it, but we will do it later. The referendum later. So as you know, the Constitution was abandoned. The Maastricht Treaty was not, but was approved, like they had learned the lesson, by the parliaments, not by referendum. So to remove from people's decision and shift it to the political parties, that of course all political parties, right and left, were part of the political class that were already in agreement with the, not elimination, but the diminishing of sovereignty and building supranationality. So Cameron promised, and for one time was a decent, democratic, conservative leader who decided he had to hold his promise. That's what he is being criticized for. Of course, he was totally for the European Union, and he thought that he would actually be able to mobilize the public opinion in favor of stay, in favor of the European Union. And he played every way. Even at one point they panicked in the leadership of Cameron. They panicked and they started to invent reasons to stay on the basis of fear. All the banks will leave the City of London. Will be no jobs anymore. Well, as you know, unemployment is much lower now after Brexit. These are the latest statistics. But the bank, that was a stupid argument, because people were so fed up with the banks, so pissed off with the banks after the crisis and the financial crisis, that they were, oh, the banks are living great, let's vote. So that all the banks leave, all the global bank work, and my little bank here could be different. Again, all this fear-mongering didn't work, and in fact, the situation overall in England has improved, in the UK has improved, and banks are happily there. You know why? Because London is the financial center of the world. Sorry guys, it's not Zurich, has never been Frankfurt, it's London, and it's not New York, it's London, in terms of the most innovative financial assets, in terms of the ability to connect to all the networks. So, not a good tactics. And then, popular leaders. Well, Cameron, of course, collapsed after that, and then he withdrew, and has been absolutely honest and clear. Would be an example to show to the people who say that all the politicians are good. No, not Cameron. He was elitist, he was everything you want, but had been honest in personal life and in what he was saying to politics. On the other hand, there was a popular leader, which is truly interesting. I like to go into the personalities, because that people make history, but not only the grassroots, the leaders of opinion. Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, who was the one against foreign immigration, against the globality, against everything. Now, who is, and he was actually very proud to say this again and again in the meeting, I cannot be against foreigners, I just defend the interests of the British people, because I am myself, I'm kind of a melting pot myself. It's true, because his grandfather was a Muslim Turk. And his grandmother came, on the one hand, came from George II family, indirect lineage. But on the other hand, she was born in New York from a connection between this British aristocracy and a Jewish family. So Johnson was in fact both from Muslim and Jewish origin, himself and his family. And in London, and he was born in New York, and then this great leader of the deprived masses was educated in Eton and Oxford. All right? So the guy was a mess in terms of the traditional, but he knew how to speak very much like Trump. So elites knowing how to speak to the masses. These are those who know how to speak to the masses, not the radical left. These elites, why? Because they have all kinds of information, all kinds of forms of mobilizing, etc. So, I think you put all these things together, you have some more concrete vision of why nobody believed that Brexit would happen, and Brexit won 52 to 48. And not only that, June 8th, Theresa May, who is a very intelligent woman, clearly for Brexit, who campaigned for Brexit inside the Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, is going to win a resounding victory. After Brexit, killing definitely all the opinions that, well, let's vote again. Let's vote again? Okay, let's vote again. General election on the program is, this is in fact another referendum for Brexit, how to implement and how to defend the interests of Britain. June 8th, you will have the answer. But I know by the polls, the answer is you will have at least 7 points of percentage in favor of policies of deepening Brexit. Trump. First of all, and most important, Trump is not a Republican. again and again and again. Trump ran an election against the two parties, the Democrats, of course, but he took on every possible major leader of the Republican Party in the primaries, 12 of them, one after another. It was like a Far West. One after another, from the right, the center, the left, and the entire establishment of the Republican Party, bam, 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 kill all of them, but with huge margins, and in every possible state, with the exception of the very liberal states, which they don't care, the Republicans, because the Republican Party cannot win in California, cannot win in New York, but it doesn't matter. Let's win in all the other little states throughout. So, again, the first is characterizing Trump as a character outside the political system who enters the campaign attacking the entire political system and all the politicians and the two parties, and said the Republicans also are a bad party, I'm coming to regenerate the Republican Party. Okay? And then he starts his program, as you know well, simply putting things together to make it coherent. It's a nationalist program, America First, which is entirely against the whole cosmopolitan culture. Let's love each other. We're in a globalized world, so we need a culture that unites. What is this idea? We are the strongest, we are going to impose our will. You know, many people decided that that's a good idea. Why we should be nice to the Arabs, allow Obama? Yeah, okay, they will be more upset because we explicitly do not help them, but okay, we'll kill them if they don't surrender. Explicitly, he said all the things that one should not say under the politically correct agreement. He decided that, except for a few, Mexicans, by and large, 120 million people, were rapists, criminals, and illegal. All of them. He explicitly said that China was ruining the world economy and cheating the United States, and he would completely transform that situation. In other words, he touched on all the things that was forbidden to say before. Of course, he was not explicitly sexist, he just practiced sexism throughout his life. And everybody knew that, and the media knew that, etc., etc. In terms of and what happened with this discourse was really a discursive battle. Those of you who analyze discourses and political discourses, is a fantastic analysis that is being done by a number of people. Everything was a coherent discourse of everything that was forbidden before. And the millions and millions of people who recognized in that discourse but could not say anything because that was not correct, they felt recognized, they felt represented, they reconnected with a politician who really speaks like them. We'll see who was this kind of public. Of course, he was held by the crazy American electoral law, the Electoral College. I will not bother you with that, it's well known, and was clearly held by Hillary, who not only did a terrible campaign and had a very negative image in the United States, women or no women, but basically the most stupid thing a party could do at that point is against a candidate like Trump that attacks the establishment to present the candidate of the establishment, of the financial establishment and the political establishment. That's what the data show. Hillary was the establishment, Trump was the anti-establishment. And listen, Trump was a billionaire and a crook, but was the anti-establishment. By the way, in Italy, Berlusconi was similar to that. Berlusconi, not similar to the social movement, was similar to what Trump did. But Trump was, at that point, a little bit more clever in the way he proceeded. Now, in addition, Trump innovated immediately in the communication strategy. He jumped into the internet and digital age. The notion of a political leader to become the President of the United States, to address the masses of the world, the masses of his country, and the world at large by Twitter, including his own administration, that's an innovation for a political leader. And because that simply bypasses the entire political system, bypasses the media. With the media, he had a genius strategy. He despised the media so much that the media hated him, and they did him the greatest possible favor, to talk about him all the time. And as you know, in communication theory, we know that the critical thing is not that they say this or they say that. The main thing is that they say. The main thing in media is the presence in the media. People don't pay attention to what is being said about someone. But what is clear is that for an entire year, Trump was and continues to be. Every evening in all the evening news of all the media saying how bad he was, how terrible person, not possible, except Fox News, everything else was against him. And it's exactly, verifies communication theory and vilifies the usual understanding that if you are criticized by the media, you are dead. No, if the media don't talk about you, you are dead. That's a different thing. Now, who voted for Trump? Very simple. Most important, whites. Overwhelmingly, the white people of America. 87% of Trump voters were white. 58% of whites, 58% voted for Trump. Okay? And so that's the first thing. And all the new statistical analysis that we are doing show that the most important factor in the election of Trump was not so much what people say was, but not so much the economic conditions, that was whiteness. Whiteness. The fact that these whites decided that it was time that they would take control of their country. There is truly a very interesting analysis of identity analysis that was published in Foreign Affairs a couple of months ago, in which is shown that one of the effects of identity politics, which is now at the top of the agenda everywhere in the world and in the United States, is that all the debates are about identity. Black identity, Latino identity, Native Americans identity, lesbian identity, gay identity, transsexual identity. Everything is about identity. And suddenly there was not a movement, but an atmosphere, a discourse of all the whites, particularly male whites, saying, wait a second, what about my identity? Nobody talks about white men. So we don't exist. Everybody has to have an exotic identity, but we, who are the real country, the real nation, we have disappeared in this identity. What about white men? That was an extremely important matter. That was linked also to the fact that one segment of these white men were extremely hurt by deindustrialization, linked to globalization, the economic crisis, etc. There's a wonderful book by the Berkeley sociologist Arlene Horschel titled Strangers in Their Own Land. A significant part, actually the large majority, of the white working class in America felt that they had been marginalized by these cosmopolitan elites of the two coasts, New York, California, etc., and the real America, the heartland of America, did not exist anymore. In the media, in the public policy, every other group had to be taken care of. Now, they were also those who were hit by the deindustrialization linked to globalization. In the years of the Obama administration, whites lost 1 million jobs, while Latinos increased in about the same, and blacks did not lose jobs anymore. So that's part of the affirmative action policies, but that's also much more important is the market, the labor market in the major metropolitan areas where the traditional white working class is not present. So it's not that necessarily they give more jobs to Latinos or to immigrants. No, it's that because those people are in the major metropolitan areas where the economy is booming. The same thing that in England, where London was booming, but the Midlands and the North were in a depressed area. So here is something that may interest you. First of all, in terms of gender, and then something more dramatic. In terms of gender, men in general voted for Trump, women in general voted for Hillary. But if we say white, uneducated women, 52% of them voted for Trump. 52% voted for Trump. With all the sexism, all the things that, because their class vote and their relationship to the communities where they were living was much more important than start bickering about gender or not gender. Non-college educated people, 71% voted for Trump. Non-college educated. Again, why? Globalization favors jobs. Yeah, but not the same kind of jobs. Globalization creates new forms of jobs, new forms of possibilities to get ahead in this society, but not for a huge amount of people who feel left out. The same thing with the elderly. And here is the one finding which people don't talk too much about it. In America, a little bit more, but I have not seen it in Europe. In these deindustrialized regions, where what's higher levels of unemployment, but not too much, about 10, 12% again. Not that everybody is unemployed, but jobs are disappearing, and the new jobs do not correspond to the traditional working class job with a culture, with a community, etc., etc. These regions is really the industrial heartland, the Midwest, and also some of the more depressed regions, the Appalachia, important the Appalachia. So in all these regions are the regions that at the same time has hit the most devastating drug epidemic in the United States. You may know that Obama said before leaving that the most serious social problem of the United States was the epidemic of opium-based drugs, legal, prescribed by the doctors, and which in fact people don't buy in the streets. They get it from their families, from their friends. Why? Because the notion now that pain is not tolerable anymore in our culture. Pain is, the absence of pain is a human right. So because of that, and because of the pharmaceutical companies jumping into that market, there is a huge consumption of opioid drugs, not illegal, through prescription. How big? Well, last year, 35,000 people died from overdose from those drugs. 3 times more than cocaine and heroin together. More than that, and then hundreds of thousands injured in rehabilitation, etc., etc. Guess what? There is an almost perfect correlation between deindustrialization, losing of jobs for the industrial working class, drugs epidemic, and voting for Trump. Now, I'm not saying that they vote for Trump because they are drugged, okay? Let's be clear about that. I said I would be non-normative. I would like to say that. Be careful if you go to drugs because you will end up voting for Trump. No, that's not a legitimate argument. What I'm saying is despair, desperation, self-destruction. And on the one hand, you go all the way to destruction, which is you take these drugs, and you are hooked. They hook much more than heroin. On the other hand, still some hope, Trump. Trump is not the desperation, it's the hope. It's the hope for all these populations. That is something, that cultural aspect of the movement toward Trump is something that has been overlooked and which is, I think, fundamental. Again, and the demographic indicator is education. 67% of non-university educated people voted for Trump, 28% for Hillary. Okay? Now, let me go into, of course, the issues where the immigration were the most important issue, and then the economy and trade, anti-globalization. It's an anti-globalization movement. Like Brexit is an anti-globalization movement in terms, because globalization in Europe is the European Union, the way to be globalized. And in terms of foreign policy, it was clear that the United States has to look at itself first, and if we have really any problem, we should solve it immediately through force and not spend too much time or too much money. And 86% of people who were voting for Trump were against government and against the way governments were representing, actually not representing the United States. So you see all the things come together. Now, keep it down on the time. Now, what happened when these people come to power? Because one thing is why people mobilize for them. Another thing is what actually happened. Because if they would implement the policies that they stated, for instance, they will stop globalization. Globalization can be reversed if they do it. Governments started globalization in 1979, 1980, in the United States and the UK, and from there into the world. Governments could stop globalization, and they campaigned as anti-globalization. And actually, the Economist had an incredible cover about Trump throwing a Molotov cocktail into the White House with the anti-globalization movement. Now, consequences. Well, in Britain, now, the very reasonable Britain now is clear. On the one hand, nationalism, the end of super sovereignty, that's what they are doing now. And at the same time, asymmetric globalization. Financial globalization, yes. This is our strength. Industrial globalization, no. And the European Union as a market, but with no movement of labor. So, what I call selective asymmetrical globalization. The convenient aspect, naturally, yes, the others, not. Trump, that's the most interesting thing. Here is where you think that politics is a lot, but it's not all. There are some heavy facts. The essence of globalization is financial globalization. That is the essence. Because if capital is global, everything is global, ultimately. Everything depends on the movement of capital in this global system. And so Trump discovered, or he knew from the beginning, and didn't say, that he has to rely, as every American president, on Wall Street. Every American president appoints to the key levers of the economic policy Wall Street people, and particularly Goldman Sachs people. And Trump is no exception. Nuking, the Secretary of Treasury, is Goldman Sachs, as with the case of Obama, Clinton, Bush, everybody. So ultimately, if the conspiracy theories about some financial elites that run the world, which I don't think so, but there is an important aspect, they have a clear culprit, Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs control every American administration in terms of economic policy. They can do whatever they want, but at least they are appointed to that. So, first, financial globalization is booming. Wall Street is booming, no question there. It's not reversing. Trump is not reversing that at all. Then, commercial protectionism, yes and no. Depending, on the one hand, he denounced the Trans-Pacific Treaty immediately. On the other hand, last week signed a very comprehensive commercial treaty with China. China was going to be denounced as a currency manipulator, which has huge consequences, and now it's not anymore. And now Trump says that President Xi is the best president that he has met. Modern things. He's going to solve all this North Korea problem, and we are going to be the best friends in the world. Of course, he had also some good rapport with Putin. Now he's hiding his love. So commercial protectionism, yes, on some specific sectors, but not on others. Particularly, protectionism against Mexico. But there, he's having problems. He wanted to slap 20% tariff on all Mexican products, and something on Canada as well. Poor Canadians, the nicer of the nicer, are the only ones who have been slapped a tariff against them in strategic sectors like forestry and milk. But other than that, Mexico for the moment, no, because they have discovered, someone told, you know, that this 20%, the Mexican imports will go into every possible industry in the United States because we all use Mexican imports for everything, starting from the California agriculture, the automobile industry, so they have stopped that thing. So what is really happening? Anti-immigration, yes. Immigration is going to be hit severely, not just the future immigration, but the current undocumented workers or even documented workers. There are raids every day, everywhere in the country, and this already has had an effect, has slowed dramatically the inflow of undocumented workers in the United States. People know it's going to be much tougher. Not stop completely, but that has changed, which is putting pressure on some key sectors. 70% of California agriculture, a key industry in the United States, employs undocumented workers from Mexico and other Latin American countries. So it's going to be a fight there. The wall, the famous wall. You know what he continues to say. Yes, we'll build it and the Mexicans will pay for it. Mexicans says, sure, that's what we can do tomorrow. Even if some president would like to do it, that would be the only case of armed insurrection. Of course, Mexican companies are lining up to build the wall. That's okay. It's good business. But no way that they're going to pay for it. So, has no money. Okay, he wants to build the wall, but has no money. And the Congress said, hey, that's not the priority of this country. We are still in this mess of the healthcare policy, etc. We're not going now to start authorizing money for the wall. So, okay, I'll do it next fall. So for the moment, the wall is waiting. Okay, let's see what, and that's what I like to show is the contradiction, because this incredible anti-globalization, and then at one point things become more complicated. However, he's acting decisively on one thing: removing all environmental constraints to the industry in the United States and in the world at large. He's not going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement because Al Gore went to see him and said, please don't do it, it's the work of my life. Said, okay, don't worry. He's just not going to pay anything or apply anything. Okay, we are in the agreement, but we don't agree on doing anything about the agreement. So that's serious. That's serious. The entire country is now open for fracking, for oil pipelines, for gas, for every possible protection has been removed. Yes, that's true, and it's going to be hostile to any international agreement on anything. That's a big change. That is a big change. But it's not about globalization, it's about the de-globalization of environmental rights. Now, two last things about Trump. One thing is he has also bumped on the notion of that he has all the power. He thought that the President of the United States is all powerful, and he started to jump over rules and institutional rules. And here's the point. It's not true that governments and states and political institutions are toothless. There are rules, and will start systematically disregarding the rules and governing by Twitter regardless of what happens, then there are legal constraints. So judges have stopped their anti-Muslim immigration ban, and he cannot do anything about it. And most importantly, what has happened recently is that all the very dirty maneuvers that happened with Russia, that he rejected again and again and again, all this dirt is catching up to the point of having to tolerate the appointment of a special prosecutor by his own Deputy Attorney General. Because at one point, if he would also stop that, that would be immediately the beginning of an impeachment process. Because the Republicans are not ready to give up on Trump yet. But what they cannot do is start simply ignoring the institutional rules that govern American democracy. So in that sense, the crisis of liberal democracy has its limits in the sense that the system cannot be dismantled entirely dependent on who comes to power. But what we can say is that the delegitimation among large segments of the population in America and other countries is such that there is a constant attempt to reach power within the institutional system, to change the rules of the game in favor of whoever is coming to power on the basis of this wave of indignation. And indignation are not only the nice Spanish indignados. They are all this American working class. They are all these regions, the industrialized around the world. And different leaders can actually try to found followers in that market, in that political market. Just one very last thing on Le Pen. Le Pen follows all the demographics of the voter are exactly what I told you. Everything. The reasons, the same thing. So which means that there is something common. There's a pattern when there's the same factor repeat again and again in different countries. The whole set of opposition to the system, institutional system in France, has also had as consequence the dismantlement of the traditional political system in France. All the big parties of France are finished, out. Socialist Party 6% and falling down, declared dead by Valls and actually by Hollande a year earlier. They have declared that the system, the Socialist Party is finished. So one of the two out. But the others, the Républicains, which is the right changing again and again of norm, they are being decomposed under the impact of what? Of two things at the same time. On the one hand, it's not true that Macron controls everything. If you look at the results of the vote in the first round of the French election, the people who voted to either leave or completely renegotiate the European Union were not only Le Pen, or Mélenchon, or a number of other small parties, is 49.7%. Ready to leave the European Union. Okay? This is the real thing. Now, Macron got 24%. That's his real vote. Coming as a savior, coming from the outside the system. He's a kind of course, much nicer guy than Trump, and a wonderful personal history and everything, but his support is 24%. 24% of the voters, which is amounts to about 20% of the French citizens. Now, the second round of the French election happened what happened in every election in which Le Pen is second. Because Le Pen is not like Trump, an unknown entity. People know they are neo-fascists. They always have been. There's no mystery about that. And therefore, in any moment of decision, everybody knew that Le Pen had no chance of becoming president of France. And will be the same in most of the districts in the legislative elections. So Trump was able to transcend the traditional parties. Le Pen developed demagogy, developed populism, etc., but cannot transcend the image and the knowledge of what she has been and her party has been for generations. So it's cornered. And that's why Macron has the possibility of building a certain hegemony, depending on how manages the other criticism, the criticism from the left side, Mélenchon and company. He didn't start very well, which shows that he's going to try to do something regardless of what happened to him. Started with insisting in the labor reform, which is exactly why Hollande pushed him out of the government, because that was going to be devastating. Well, first thing to do, labor reform. Good. That's exactly what the French unions and the French traditional left need to reconstruct an anti-Macron movement in 3 months. Okay? But again, my point is not about that. My point is about the fact that in both cases, any regeneration or any restructuring of the political system is coming from the outside, from outsiders, from people like Macron, who was and was not in the Socialist Party, and certainly did not run as socialist and did not run as is no right, no left, is me. Which I think is something that to which the French these days are very sympathetic. Why? Because they are fed up with the right and with the left. Again, we go back to the same system. And one last sentence is the mechanism of control of democracy are there for the fundamental facts of democracy, which is what Robert Scarpi said many years ago. You know what? After all, democracy is when they knock your door at 5 in the morning and you think is the milkman. So this restrictive notion of democracy that in fact comes from Locke, that yes, but everything else, that is the entire construction of trust and management of the political institution, is in shambles around the world, and particularly in the 3 countries, 3 important countries that that I have analyzed. Saying this in Switzerland, there is always at the same time a level of incredulity, and at the same time a wonderful feeling that there is still something in terms of civilization going on. But so you are doing something good, and someone should be more explicit in analyzing that. However, I guess if things go this way, soon your main economic activity will not be financial, but will be to be a tourist country in which all the children in the world will come to see how was democracy when it existed. Thank you.
C'è un po' di tempo per le domande. Chi si lancia?
Professor Castells, if you're familiar with Peter Berger, Richard Newhouse arguments about delegitimation in America, the naked Peter Berger and Richard Newhouse, the argument about delegitimation that you started out talking about, the naked public square, the idea that over the last 50 years the American public square has been stripped of common reference. If you're familiar with that body of work, how would it impinge on your own thinking, or what would you have to say about if you're familiar with that body of work?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think that the mechanism of sociability and civility come fundamentally from the minds of the people. So it's not about the form of cities, and it's not about the vitality, let's say, the notion of civic associations as being the founding of America, because it's about the ability of people to believe what they are doing. So what is clear is that the gap is between citizens and the political system. Citizens among themselves, I think there's still a very active social life and a very active civic life. And that's, to some extent, is being lost in the metropolitan areas because of the kind of space that is being constructed, and although it is recovered through the internet, but it's not the same. And therefore, I would say, yes, there is an argument that public space is the space of the public, and the disappearance of public space damages the quality of civic interaction. No question about that. Moreover, public space has been replaced, theoretically, but by the shopping malls as the public space. Well, no, shopping malls are private. They can lock it up. Okay, and they can establish rules on what you can do and not do in a shopping mall. So the replacement of the traditional public space by commercial surveilled space is not a solution. And in that sense, yes, I agree. I just put less emphasis in how much determining is the spatial form. I see more in interaction between what's happening in our minds and what's happening in our cities, but definitely the lack of public space is a fundamental part of the crisis of civility and therefore of democracy.
Professor Castells, first of all, many thanks for your wonderful conference. I would like to have an opinion of you about the evident incapability of the leftist parties all over the world to represent the interests of the deprivated strata, which was until now their traditional task. Many thanks.
Thank you. That's one of the fundamental parts of the crisis of political legitimacy. That the people who were usually represented by the left-wing parties don't have anyone to represent them. It's much more a crisis of the left than a crisis of the right, although in broader terms it's an institutional crisis. Well, it's very simple. The left-wing parties started to do right-wing policies. I mean, the most typical example is the Third Way, Tony Blair, etc., etc. Theoretically, that was representing the interests of the welfare state, the interests of the peace movement, and suddenly he and the Labour Party started to practice systematically neoliberal policies and invading Iraq on a false pretext. So that was extremely serious. The same thing happened in the Spanish Socialist Party. That was one of the key elements in the Indignados crisis, etc., in which the socialist prime minister, the crisis started with the socialist prime minister, Rodríguez Zapatero, who in 2010 denied that would be any crisis. There were no crises, simply. So no policies. And then when he realized after a few months that there was a crisis, then he called Merkel, and Merkel said, okay, I can help you, but first change the Spanish constitution. And he agreed with the Conservative Party, and in the middle of August, not many citizens around, they changed the Spanish constitution. That theoretically is a very difficult thing to do, but not if the two main parties agree and in 24 hours change the constitution. To introduce an article which is the most ridiculous constitutional article I have ever seen, forbidding budget deficit by constitution. I mean, this is a matter of budgetary policy, of economic policy, but making a constitutional crime to go over a certain limit of budget deficit, that he only did it because of the pressure from Merkel. And that doomed the Socialist Party that since then the latest news is that yesterday, a leader of the Socialist Party that had refused to continue these policies and was dismissed, even he was Secretary General, went to the militants of the party, 200,000 of them, and called for primaries, and he wiped out the entire establishment of the Socialist Party, and there is a huge crisis in Spain because he defeated the banks, the Conservative Party, the existing bureaucracy of the party, and Felipe González, who all were against him. And he just called for the militants to become again a left-wing party. If that's the case, the whole system is jeopardized at this point because it's based on the assumption that the socialists will always go along with the right. So it's an example to show the opposite, that there is a way in which sometimes happen. But let's say the right is the right and the left is the left. And this hasn't changed. But when the left stops being the left, then there is a problem.
Why in England the left, that was career left, doesn't win?
Oh, excuse me?
Why, if it's true, the real left, England, militant, doesn't win?
Oh. That's because that came after Blair had destroyed the basis of the Labour Party. The Labour Party was in shambles after years of domination of Blair. There are other issues. But the most important one is that some of the key policies, the Labour Party and the Socialist Party is very simple. They were based on two things: expansion and defense of the welfare state, regardless of the economic cost, and defense of the labor movement. That's it. And that Miliband did not reverse. He used sentences of a different kind. He adopted a language of the left, but with the idea that in any case, the world has globalized, there is automation, we have to modernize, etc. And maybe he's right. But I'm simply saying, by doing that, lost the traditional base at the time in which the traditional base was still there. That's one reason. The other reason, deepening in terms of the conversation on this matter, is the inability of the left and right to address the issues of the youth. The youth are completely outside the political system. And this hurts more the left and the right, because the youth are usually agents of social and political change, while the right, it's enough for them that the system keeps reproducing. So none of the big parties had been able to deal with the youth. Certainly not Blair, but neither Miliband, because of privileging issues that were institutional and not cultural, not social.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for your conference. And you started talking about the gap between the political and the people, political people. I find that many politicals are so far away from knowing what the people are thinking and feeling that they're just on the wrong side, Cameroon and so on. But the other problem, according to me, the major problem of everything is the education. Education in different countries are different, but it's always going down, down, down. There's no dialogue. People do not know how to express themselves, don't know how to reason with their own mind. And that is the biggest problem, I think, for the future, for me.
I think I totally share your opinion in this, because ultimately, if we believe, it's been shown that our behavior, our political behavior is largely conditioned by the way we think and what happens in our minds. What happens in our minds is not only our genetic heritage, it's how we are educated. And particularly in a world of what we call post-truth or fake news or whatever, which internet is a wonder because everything can be in the internet, but it's not a wonder if there is no discriminating capacity to find in the internet what is useful, recombining, etc., etc. So the more we have information and the more we have disinformed people, meaning uneducated, the more the contradiction is serious. So, absolutely right. But the issue, of course, is why education is deteriorating. Part of it is it's no budget priority in many countries. In some countries during the crisis, but another part of it is that the educational system, particularly the educators, and I am one of them, we are largely obsolete. Obsolete in terms of connecting to the real issues of the students, and obsolete in reproducing models that are exhausted. Even the universities. Universities continue to believe in a sort of pedagogy which literally has not changed much since at least 2 centuries. And there are elements to be conserved, certainly, but no one is really from the university administration, with some exceptions, thinking about what is education, primary education, secondary education, now in relationship to what has been. And there are courageous efforts, but there is, in my opinion, the most important problem. And this is our problem as educators. We are corporatists. We defend our interests. Most professors, including myself, if you want, or my colleagues, think that the universities are made to serve the professors, not the students, because it's very costly. It's very costly. So you're right, I am right, but it's a problem.
So maybe this is becoming a little dangerous. So maybe one last question. One. Well, he was first.
Thank you for your lecture. It's a pleasure to hear from you after reading you so extensively. And I would like to underline just a little contradiction that I see in the presentation you made, because you began with a quite optimistic statement. You say that the movements of 2011 and after 2011 changed the mind of people around the world. Not only in the countries where these movements were, but also in other countries. And yet you ended your discourse by saying that we are in a very deep crisis of liberal democracy, and that maybe the place where we are now will be like a zoo of democracy in the future, where people come to see what democracy was. The question, I think, that the theoretical and practical point that I see very difficult is how to transform that social force that formed in 2011 into a political one. Because I think that is the point that we are missing. How to make this transformation. I think maybe the problem is in the neoliberal declination of democracy. And I think that some elites are now more willing to sacrifice democracy than neoliberalism. And that's the problem. But on the other hand, we have no forces that are able to transform that social intelligence, that social force that formed in 2011 into a political one. The case of Podemos is particularly interesting under this perspective. I remember your conversation with Pablo Iglesias in La Tuerca, and you ended by suggesting that the spirit of the nets that formed the Indignados movement must be taken also into the political field. But I think this is not the road that Podemos has taken. So I would like to know from you what you think about this transformation from social to political force.
Thank you. Sure.
Yes, I think it's maybe, if not similar, linked. So thank you very much also from my side. If I understood correctly, the political dynamics that you described took advantage of the need for control of people, somehow deceiving this need and taking advantage. So I wanted to ask if you have any suggestion for people to take again control by themselves.
Thank you. Well, let's go fast because you are tired. And I don't say what to do, what is to be done. I'm sorry about that, because I get people infuriated around the world. But I see I don't have any special authority or legitimacy to say what to do, because certainly I try to influence the debate, I participate in the debate, but I see myself much more in the traditional role, not as a citizen. As a citizen, absolutely. I have my opinions, I fight for them, etc., etc. But as an analyst, I see myself very much like the role of traditional psychoanalyst. They tell you which problem you have, and they say, now is your point. Now you do it. Manage. Because no one can replace anyone. It's only you as a person, social groups, countries, they have to take care of them. So the role of the analyst is to make as clear as possible and as objective as possible, which is not possible completely, of course, which are the issues and what's happening and why. And then it's up to people, individually and collectively, to take up how to modify the situation. Among other things, because people are plural. And what for you would be wonderful for someone else is a disaster. Not everybody has to be critical of neoliberalism. Very good people are neoliberal, so they also take advantage of this. So that's why I would not venture too much in this matter. But it's actually content what I'm saying, and not simply saying that is not possible. But what I want to say in terms of the political impact, it's actually related to your question as well. Look, it's maybe analytically is too rigid, but social movements and the movements that I have observed, both on left and right, are aimed at changing the way people think. Political movements are strategic movements to shape policies and take control of the state. And there is a relationship, certainly, but not even necessarily the same actors. And the case that you cite of Podemos, which is really the most important case in Europe in the terms of the process, very explicitly, Podemos decided to try to have a political expression respecting the movement and not interfering with whatever the movement would do spontaneously. Breaking this tradition in which it starts as a movement, then there is a party, and there is a transmission belt, and the party becomes the worst bureaucracy, which has been the tradition, by the way, between the working class and the social democracy. So Podemos is trying to escape that. Now, this movement of transformation of political institutions is very slow compared with the transformation of consciousness and the transformation of social mobilization. 67% of the Spanish population between 2011 and 2016 supported the movement, supported what the movement was proposing and doing, and particularly the critique of the movement. The moment it comes to the political institutions, to vote, to election, things become much more complicated, because it's the role of the media, the role of campaigns of disinformation. For instance, Podemos had a huge issue until he was able to shrug off the notion that they were agents of the Venezuelan government. No, they had been in Venezuela, they had been in Bolivia, I have been in Bolivia, doesn't make me an agent of the Bolivian government. So they had a long way, and then they made huge mistakes, like thinking that they have actually already reached the stage of revolution and starting to say things that they couldn't do. Because they were, in fact, very young. Not so much the people also are young, but fundamentally, they didn't have any experience. They made huge mistakes, and they are rectifying all the time. But for the moment, they still have managed to blow up the Spanish political system, which was based on the alternance between Conservative Party and Socialist Party. The two big parties in 2011, the last general election just after the movement, had 75% of the vote. Now, according to the polls, they have 48% of the vote between the two parties. And in the last election and not polls, they had 50% of the vote. So this is in just a few years, in just 5 years, yeah. They left They went down from 75% of the vote together to 50%, and the movement continues downward. What happened is that Podemos alone could not become the political actor that would transform the entire system. That's why something else had to happen, and this something else is just the transformation of the Socialist Party that may not survive the crisis. But what happened is that the militants of the Socialist Party decided that they don't want Podemos, they are socialists, but they are not ready to be part of any grand coalition. And that is completely changing the political system. So that's my point, is the time is a slow time when you reach the institutions, but all the institutions are having dramatic impacts of what happened in different ideological levels of different movements. That's what I was trying to go one country after another country. And yes, the Boule Nuit was somewhat deorganized by Hollande, although the experience that we have in social movements is that when they cannot keep occupying squares, at one point you have to go home. Okay, so but they continue to live in the networks. That's the difference. They continue to live in the networks, and they are there. And something that happens, this spark that happens somewhere, they go back to the streets. That's the experience of the movement. So the Boule Nuit did not develop more in terms of social movement, but La France Insoumise, with 16% of the vote, appeared from somewhere. And it's not Mélenchon, who was always a very boring bureaucrat of the left. So it's in spite of himself that he got, in fact, 19.2% in the last election, out of nowhere. And the same thing with Bernie Sanders, that people say, where did Bernie Sanders come from? Well, he was in Occupy Wall Street. He was actually in the camps. And suddenly, he was very close to be the person nominated by the Democratic Party. So my point is that, yes, there is an absolute necessity for policies to be transformed, and ultimately the people's life to be transformed, that whatever happens new has to go through the institutional system. The issue there is the institutional system open enough for this transformation, for this new input or not? According to Podemos, only Switzerland is able to do that. Thank you.